Okay, okay, you can do this. You've done this before. No, no. Everyone's already got enough going on.
Jordan Blake had shown up for 3 different friends in crisis that same week. A divorce, a miscarriage, a father's funeral. Steady, composed, exactly the person each of them needed. Tonight, sitting alone outside a hospital with news about her own mother, she realized she couldn't think of a single person to call who had ever once been asked to catch her. Welcome to Fresh Start Stories, inspiring stories about life, change, and the courage to begin again. Like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Jordan Blake had a reputation, the kind people mentioned proudly at parties as though it belonged to them too. Jordan is the strong one. Jordan always knows what to say. Jordan never falls apart. It had taken her years to build that reputation and exactly 0 effort to maintain it, because falling apart, for Jordan, had simply stopped being something she considered an option somewhere around her sophomore year of college, when her parents' brief, brutal separation had left her, at 19, functioning as the calm center of a family that badly needed one. She was 30 now, and the role had calcified into identity so completely that Jordan genuinely could not remember the last time she had cried in front of another person. Not couldn't recall a specific date, could not, searching honestly, locate a single memory of it happening since she was 19 years old. The week that broke something loose started on a Monday with Sarah. Sarah called at 11 p.m., her voice already wrecked, and told Jordan that her husband of 6 years had asked for a divorce over dinner, calmly, between bites of pasta, as though he were discussing a change in cable providers. Jordan drove to Sarah's apartment at midnight, sat with her until 4 in the morning, said all the right things in all the right order, and drove home telling herself she'd sleep in on Tuesday to make up for it. She did not. At one point, around 2 a.m., Sarah had asked her, almost as an afterthought, "How are you doing, though? Really?" And Jordan had answered so smoothly, so immediately, "I'm okay, don't worry about me. This is about you right now," that neither of them noticed the question had never actually been answered. It was a sentence Jordan had said so many times across so many crises that it had stopped registering as a deflection even to her. On Wednesday, it was Ben. His wife had lost the pregnancy they'd spent 2 years trying for at 11 weeks, and Ben, who rarely called anyone about anything, called Jordan first, before even calling his own mother because, his exact words, "You're the one who knows what to actually say." Jordan sat with him in a diner booth for 3 hours, said the right things again, and drove home past midnight for the second time that week, noting distantly, the way you notice weather, that she felt increasingly hollow and increasingly unable to name why. At the diner, Ben had cried the specific, disoriented way people cry when grief arrives somewhere they weren't braced for it. Not at the loss itself yet, but at having to say the word miscarriage out loud to another person for the first time. Jordan had reached across the table and held his hand without hesitation. The same steady gesture she'd used 100 times before, and some small, exhausted part of her had noted distantly that she couldn't remember the last time anyone had reached for her hand first. By Friday, it was Tom, whose father had died that morning after a long illness everyone had known was coming and nobody had actually been ready for. Jordan sat beside him at the funeral home while he chose a casket, held his hand through decisions no one should have to make at 31, and drove home afterward with her hands shaking slightly on the wheel, a detail she noticed and immediately filed away as unimportant, the way she filed away most things about her own state that might have required attention. It was her sister, not Jordan herself, who called Saturday morning with the actual reason Jordan ended up in that hospital parking lot. Their mother had collapsed at home, was already at the hospital, and the early tests were not good. Jordan's sister, Kayla, was crying too hard on the phone to drive, so Jordan drove. Of course Jordan drove. Jordan always drove, and sat in the parking lot for 11 full minutes afterward before she could make herself go inside, because for the first time in longer than she could locate, she did not feel like the person capable of walking into that building and being calm for anyone. She thought, sitting there, about calling someone. She actually opened her contacts. Sarah was still shattered from Monday. Ben had barely stopped shaking since Wednesday. Tom had a funeral in 2 days. Jordan looked at a list of people who loved her, genuinely loved her, and understood with a strange, clean clarity that not one of them had ever been given a reason to think she might need calling. She scrolled slowly, name by name, running the same calculation for each one. Sarah, still shattered. Ben, barely holding together. Tom, a funeral in 2 days. Her college roommate, 3 time zones away and newly pregnant, someone Jordan had already decided not to worry with anything heavy. Her father, whom she hadn't called with real news in years, not since she'd learned at 19 that he wasn't always steady enough to receive it. By the time she reached the end of the alphabet, she understood something she hadn't let herself understand before. It wasn't that no one loved her enough to call. It was that she had spent a decade carefully teaching every person who loved her that she didn't need to be called. She went inside alone. Kayla found her in the hallway 20 minutes later, and instead of the gratitude Jordan expected, said something that landed like a slap. "You drove 11 minutes late. I know because I counted. Where were you?" Jordan started to explain. The parking lot, the contacts list, the impossible math of who was left to call. And Kayla, exhausted and terrified and not particularly interested in being gentle in that moment, cut her off. "You always do this. You disappear into being fine so completely that nobody even knows to check on you. I needed you 5 minutes ago, and I didn't know if you'd even show up broken or not, because you never let any of us see the difference." Her mother's diagnosis, when it came an hour later, was serious, but not immediately life-threatening. A cardiac event requiring surgery, real recovery, real fear, but survivable. Jordan absorbed this news the way she absorbed all news now, calmly, usefully, already mentally organizing the logistics of care schedules and hospital paperwork before the doctor had finished the sentence. The surgery, scheduled for 2 hours, stretched into 4. A nurse came out once, at hour 3, to say only that there had been an unexpected complication and that the surgeon would explain everything once it was resolved. 6 words that emptied the waiting room of oxygen. Jordan sat with Kayla's hand gripped so tightly in hers that her fingers went numb, and for the first time in the entire week, she let herself say out loud to her sister, "I don't know what I'll do if this goes wrong," instead of managing the moment into something smaller and safer for everyone else to witness. It was Alex, a coworker she was not particularly close to, who found her 20 minutes later in the hospital's fluorescent-lit stairwell, sitting on the concrete steps with her face in her hands, finally crying. Not the composed, tasteful crying she might have allowed herself in front of Sarah or Ben, but the ugly, gasping kind she hadn't let herself do in 11 years. Alex had come to the hospital visiting his own grandmother and recognized her only by the coat. Jordan's first instinct, hearing footsteps, was to wipe her face fast and stand up, already reaching for the composed voice she'd used on Sarah, on Ben, on Tom. "I'm fine," she said automatically, already halfway to her feet. "Just needed a second." Alex didn't argue with her and didn't leave either. He simply sat down anyway, which left Jordan standing there, still visibly wrecked, with nowhere honest to put the lie she'd just told. He didn't say anything wise. He didn't have Jordan's gift for exactly the right words. He just sat down on the concrete step beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, and stayed there in silence for what turned out to be nearly 20 minutes, until Jordan's breathing evened out enough to speak. "I don't know how to do this part," she finally said, meaning, though she couldn't have articulated it yet, not the hospital, not her mother, but the specific, unfamiliar mechanics of being the one who needed catching. "You don't have to know how," Alex said. "You just have to let someone try." Jordan did not transform overnight into someone who called people freely when she struggled. The habit of a decade doesn't dissolve because of one stairwell. But she did call Kayla back that same evening, and instead of immediately organizing logistics, said the sentence she genuinely could not remember saying to another human being in 11 years. "I'm scared, and I don't want to do the next part of this alone." Her mother's surgery ultimately went well. The complication managed, the recovery real but survivable, exactly as promised. Jordan sat in the waiting room with Kayla, and when Sarah, recovering, texted to ask how Jordan was holding up, Jordan typed and deleted, "I'm fine. Thanks for asking 4 times before finally sending something else entirely. Honestly, not great. Could use company if you have any to spare." When Sarah arrived with the coffee and the blanket, she didn't ask Jordan to explain anything first. She simply sat down beside her in the hospital waiting room chair, close enough that their shoulders touched. The same gesture Alex had used on the stairwell, Jordan would realize only later. And said, "You don't have to talk. I just didn't want you doing this part alone." It was, Jordan realized, the exact sentence she had said to Sarah herself 3 weeks earlier, handed back to her now like something she hadn't known she was allowed to receive. Sarah showed up within the hour with coffee and a blanket, and no expectation that Jordan would be composed, and something in Jordan that had been braced for over a decade finally, quietly, set itself down. 6 months later, Jordan's mother fully recovered. Jordan found herself at Tom's kitchen table. Tom, whose father's funeral she'd helped arrange, now steady enough to be the one checking on her, telling him, haltingly, about a harder week at work than she'd let anyone see. Tom didn't fix it. He didn't have the perfect sentence. He just listened, the way she had listened for a decade, and Jordan understood, sitting there, that this was what she had actually been missing. Not advice, not solutions, just the specific relief of being witnessed without having to perform being fine first. If you've ever been the one everyone calls and no one thinks to call back, if being strong has quietly become the only version of you anyone's ever met, this one's for you. Being needed by everyone was never the same thing as being known by anyone. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't holding everyone else together one more time. It's finally letting someone see you when you can't. If this story reminded you that you're allowed to need catching too, hit subscribe. We've got more stories like Jordan's waiting for you.